How's it going, guys? In this video I'm going to go over the top 5 tips for beginners in cribbage. For tip number 1, you want to avoid playing 5, 10, 21, or 26 when pegging. Face cards are the most common card in cribbage. That means that when you play something that adds up to 5 or 21, it's fairly likely that your opponent could play a face card and get 2 points. You also don't want to play 10 or 26 because 5s are very valuable in cribbage. Because 5s are very valuable, your opponent is likely to keep them in their hand, especially when it is your crib. If it's your crib, your opponent is probably not going to throw a 5 if they are a good player, because 5s are good cards and you don't want to throw good cards into your opponent's crib. With that in mind, when it's your crib, it's wise to assume that your opponent isn't going to throw a 5 into your crib, so they are more likely to have it in their hand. So that means if you play a 10 or a 26, your opponent is likely to get 2 points, especially if it's your crib. For tip number 2, you want to be cautious when choosing what cards to throw into your opponent's crib. You don't want to throw points into your opponent's crib because you are losing double the amount of points you give your opponent. For example, if I were to throw a 5 and a king into my opponent's crib, then I would lose 2 points for the 15, and my opponent would gain 2 points, giving me a net loss of 4 points. As a general rule, you want to try to avoid throwing cards that add up to 5. And you also want to avoid throwing cards that are consecutive. So 6, 7, 8, 9, ace, 2, 3. Any combination of those cards, you want to try to avoid throwing in your opponent's crib. In the bottom right corner, I provided some examples of good cards to throw into your opponent's crib. But some of the worst cards you can throw to your opponent's crib would be a 5, a 2 and a 3, and a 7 and an 8. Because that breaks 2 of our rules. That breaks giving them consecutive cards, which gives them a chance to get runs of 3, and it gives them either points or cards that add up to 5. For tip number 3, you want to look to play your ace through 4 before playing a 5 through king when pegging. The reason for this is it avoids your opponent getting 15, and the only way that they can get points is if they pair you. Not only that, but it can set yourself up to get 15. For example, if you were to play a 2 and then your opponent plays a face card, you could get 15. I will now insert some clips to show you guys what I'm talking about. In the first clip, I play a 4 first in an attempt to set myself up. If my opponent plays a face card, then I can play my ace and get 15. And in the second clip, I play a 3 first, assuming that my opponent's going to play a face card, and I play a 2 to get 15. As a basic recap, you want to play ace through 4 before playing 5 through king. This avoids the possibility of your opponent getting 15, and you can set yourself up. For the fourth tip, you want to avoid double whammies. And what I mean by that is you want to avoid the opportunity for your opponent to get combo points when pegging. For example, if you were to end on 23, let's say, don't play a 4 because that would leave you on 27. And then if your opponent played a 4, they would not only get 2 points for pairing you, they would also get 2 points for landing on 31. You also need to be very cautious when your opponent plays a 4, a 5, or a 6 to avoid combo points. If your opponent plays a 4, for example, avoid playing a 5 or a 6 because if you play a 6, for example, you would end on 10. And then, if your opponent were to play a 5, they would get 2 for 15 and 3 for a run of 3. I will now provide a couple of clips to show you guys what I'm talking about. When I say avoid double whammies, this is kind of what I mean. So right here in this example, you'd want to avoid playing your 6 or either of your 5s, because if your opponent has a 5 or a 6, then they would get a run of 3 for 3 points plus 15 for 2 points. In this clip, I avoid playing my 5 first because my opponent played a 4. And this is a perfect example because the next card that my opponent played was a 6. And that means that if I would have played my 5, we would have ended on 9, and my opponent would have gotten a 15 for 2 and a run of 3 for 5. For the fifth and final tip, you should be cautious when pairing your opponent to try and avoid triples. Triples is when your opponent gets 3 of a kind while pegging and is worth 6 points. One way to avoid triples is to only pair your opponent with a safe pair. A safe pair is when you pair your opponent but the count is too high for your opponent to get triples. For example, if you were to play 7, then your opponent plays a jack, you could safely pair them with another jack without them getting triples, because the count would be at 27, and you can't go over 31, so they couldn't play a jack and get triples. To further illustrate my point, I'll provide a couple clips. In both of these clips, I show instances where I played a card first, and then my opponent unwisely paired me, not realizing that I could have had another card to get triples. And you want to try to avoid triples at all costs, guys.